was a point in the history of the universe where suddenly there emerged consciousness or some form of basic experience. It's a radical jump in the history of the universe, right? Because first of all, the universe was completely insentient, completely unconscious, and then bang, like a switch, where suddenly there's a perspective on reality from reality. Panpsychism is the view that this never happened, that there's just been a gradual evolution of consciousness through the history of the cosmos. What we understand by matter is inadequate, insufficient. The panpsychist view is that if we understood matter more sufficiently, it would contain elements of mind within it.
Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes is a philosopher of mind who doesn't just study consciousness, he wants to rewrite how we think about reality. He's a research fellow at the University of Exeter, co-founder of the Philosophy of Psychedelics group, and the author of Noumenautics and the Modes of Sentience, books that explore whether your mind is more than just a simple meat machine and if the universe might be conscious too. His ideas on panpsychism and psychedelic metaphysics have inspired actual Marvel comics and probably induced a few existential crises. He argues that panpsychism, although often dismissed as woo-woo, might be the most logically rigorous idea we have for consciousness, and makes his case convincingly through a brief history of consciousness ideas through time. Remember to please subscribe to the channel. We're going all in to make the most giant science content possible in 2026, or risk waking up one day in a universe that was sentient the whole time and it did not like being ignored.
The proposition is the brain is necessary and sufficient for consciousness. That is a proposition. Where's the evidence for that?
Yeah.
There is no evidence for that. There's no evidence for materialism either. There's no evidence for emergentism. This is woo-woo, just as woo-woo stuff, that the brain generates consciousness. Where's the evidence? You see correlation. There is massive disagreement on what reality is.
I might be a panpsychist by the end of this conversation. I can't tell. or radically close to it every minute. Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes. I hope I pronounced that right. Welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
What is panpsychism?
Panpsychism. Pan means all, psychism, psyche, all is psyche, is coined by Patrizzi in the 16th century, a Renaissance thinker. And it means that all of nature, all of the entities of nature have mind or consciousness of some sort. Maybe it's not fully conscious as we know it, but subconscious or experiential at least. So that means that, organisms such as ourselves, humans, have mind, but also insects, plants, fungi, molecules, atoms, all the way down. It's all the way down consciousness, but it's not consciousness of everything. So, although it should be by definition. So there's an important distinction to be made between aggregates and monads. So, for example, this pen, it hasn't got a consciousness per se, because it's not an entity, or it's not a self-sufficient unit, as it were, whereas a plant has, In most forms of panpsychism today, there are various forms, and they will differ slightly.
Yes.
But I just add, though, that panpsychism, coined by Patrizzi, is more of what we today would understand as pantheism. So that means mind all the way up instead of all the way down. But that connotation has changed through the years.
How should I think about my own subjectivity, my own subjective agency, my own consciousness under a panpsychism or a pantheistic lens?
I suppose you would think of human consciousness as just a very evolved form of the consciousness that exists throughout nature. So a complex form that brings in many different sense modalities and introspection and so on. But as only a difference in degree compared with other forms of life, as opposed to a difference in kind. So the general idea of today, arguably, is emergentism. That the brain makes emerge the mind, or the brain generates the mind. And there's a question as to where that started. Most people don't believe it's only humans. Descartes did, of course, but although he was a dualist. But Where do we start? Do we start at the lobster level, as we say in philosophy of mind? Anything less complex than that doesn't have mind. But at the least, generally, the general worldview today in the West is probably that there was a point in the history of the universe where suddenly there emerged consciousness or some form of basic experience, right? Whatever that organism might have been. And this is actually, if you believe this, it's a radical jump in the history of the universe, right? Because first of all, the universe was completely insentient, completely unconscious, and then bang! No matter how simple it was, it wouldn't have gradually come in. There must have been like a switch where suddenly there's a perspective on reality from reality, right? Emerging out of reality. That's emergentism. Panpsychism is the view that this never happened, that there's just been a gradual evolution of consciousness through the history of the cosmos. And so you don't have this jump up. And so the way of thinking of human consciousness is just, sort of the current point of that development. But it's not something particularly special. So it's kind of more of a, I don't know, in one way, more of a naturalistic perspective.
Yes. But the elements that make me are instantiated in my biology in some way. The elements that make you, Peter, are in your biological system in some way. But consciousness itself, and correct me if any of this is wrong, is not in our biological system. It is something more fundamental at the bedrock of reality. And then it's something like the interaction between those two gives me my subjectivity. This is why I struggle with this. So let's help me try understand this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, generally, panpsychists, again, today, the common form, which you get, like exemplified in Galen Strawson, who's a sort of British analytic philosopher, is an identity form of identity theory. So it's not that consciousness somehow separate from biology. It's sort of, part and parcel of biology. The only issue is that when we say biology or physiology, essentially matter, some kind of living matter, what we understand by matter is inadequate, insufficient sort of concept. So we don't really fully understand what matter is. I mean, in physics, of course, this is constantly developing, and if you look at the history of the concept of matter, it's changed through the years. With Descartes, you had just pure extension. As the years went by, you added mass, charge, spin, etc., etc. But we don't believe that we've achieved, the absolute understanding of matter at the moment. So when we talk about even biology as a material substrate, we still don't fundamentally understand what that is. And there are different theories about it amongst physicists even, some of which are contradictory. But so the panpsychist view is that what we understand if we understood matter more sufficiently, it would contain elements of mind within it. So it's not that mind is separate from biology, let's say, but it's biology is rather richer than we generally understand it to be.
And when you use the word mind, can you kind of expand outwards on exactly what you mean by that word? You have a mental model in your head of mind whenever you use that word. Like what's the best way to think about mind in this case?
Well, as you probably know, it's a very ambiguous term, right? And Swedish doesn't even have a word for mind, really. It has sort of
really,
it has sin and vetenskap, knowledge and so on, but it doesn't really have this word mind. Word mind in English is also, quite ambiguous, has etymologies going back to memory and intellect. What do I understand by it? Well, it's the old question, what is consciousness, essentially, right? So the way I look at it, I always have looked at it not always, I've developed a way of looking at it in a tripartite manner, right, in three ways. So one could talk about the contents of consciousness. So that would be things like, sensations, colors, sound, sense, etc. Cognition in terms of reason, inference, conceptualization, and then modes of those contents like the speed, the time rate of consciousness, whether it's veridical or delusionary, and so on and so forth. So that's basically the remit of phenomenology, like really introspecting and understanding, what we as humans, how we experience the world. That's one way. The second way is to say, well, to understand mind, it's really useful to sort of argue what it's not, right? So how is mind distinctive from non-mind, generally meaning matter, the concept matter? So then we can talk about things like privacy. I mean, all of these are debatable now, and this is why there's no solid answer to the question, right? Because when you give an answer, they're all debatable. But I'll tell you, just list a few basic debates. So privacy, a lot of people argue that the mind is private, so I can feel my toothache, you can't. You can infer it if my mouth is bleeding and I'm saying I've got a terrible toothache, but you can't feel it, right? And this kind of makes study of the mind, problematic in a way, because it becomes privacy or first-person access means non-empirical or unobservational, right? And this is why probably we have the hard problem of consciousness and mind-matter problem. So privacy is one of this second branch. Another one, which is more common in philosophy of mind today, is intentionality, although it comes from Brentano and actually before that. So that's the notion that mental states always are about something, they kind of reach out. So in love, something is loved, in hate, something is hated, and thought, something is thought about, and so on, right? This is something that mental states have, but my pen doesn't seem to have. It doesn't reach out. Hasn't got the relationality. And there are other contenders as well. Descartes famously said that mind is non-spatial and matter is spatial. William James debated this because imaginations can be spatial. If you imagine triangles, it has spatial properties, right? Non-inferentiality from Bertrand Russell, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, that's the second strand. How does, all these debates about how mental states or mind might differ from non-mind. And then thirdly, we could talk about the relations of mind. So not the differences so much, but the relations. So we can talk about how the concepts mind and matter relate. This is the fundamental mind-matter problem, right? So we can talk about, traditionally you've got dualism from Plato and Descartes, that mind and matter are completely separate substances. Perhaps they interact, perhaps they don't interact with Leibniz, but they interact with Descartes, for example, and that's the belief in the soul. So when you die, the soul survives. Another option is the physicalism. There's many types. So like the mind is the brain, or at least parts of the activity of the brain, simply identical, like the morning star and the evening star, identical, Venus. Or emergentism, that the brain and nervous system generates the mind, common today, like I said, also common over 100 years ago with British emergentism, or, etc., different types of physicalism. Another option is idealism, which is, big in Germany 200 years ago, and in Britain, actually, at the beginning of the 20th century, the British idealists. So that's the view that mind is the fundamental substance, not matter, and matter is really a projection. We project the world we see for evolutionary reasons, we'd say today. So, colors and scents and sounds don't really exist out there. They're just our way of perceiving the world. But if you take that more radically with Kant, for example, even space and time are projections and don't really exist mind independently. And then there's a kind of absolute monism, so epitomized by Spinoza, and that's that mind and matter are both different expressions of a fundamental substance, which he calls God or nature. And then there's also, one should take into account the possibility of transcendent forms like truths of mathematics and so on, which seem to have some kind of existence which is more solid than, let's say, fictional characters like Sherlock Holmes. So like the Pythagorean theorem seems to have a kind of subsistence, or a kind of truth, which is not dependent on anyone ever thinking about it, right? So it would have been true before humans existed. So anyway, and some philosophers argue that you need to take that into account when you're thinking about mind. So yeah, that's basically, if you ask what is mind, then there's just three main ways to go, like the phenomenology, the contents, the differences, differentiations like privacy and so on, and the relations like idealism, physicalism, dualism, whatever, right? And all of those, especially the third way to go, involves centuries or if not millennia of thought. And the interesting thing about the 21st century, I find, is that these questions have opened up again, and there seems to be no real agreement. Whereas towards the end of the 20th century, there's a kind of agreement coming on, and a kind of common sense. Well, what was believed to be a common sense view, but that kind of fell apart. And so that's why I think panpsychism has become popular again to a certain extent, because we're starting from the beginning again. And so we're looking at the past and thinking, have we completely misunderstood this question? Like
Yes.
what the ancient thinkers tell us, or what might they tell us?
It was a great historical overview. You can tell that you lecture on this stuff, right? You just have all the names and all of the different. I hope the listeners were able to follow along there. I try to keep these. I'll put all of the definitions at the bottom so people can follow along as much as possible. But I feel like it's just going to be rapid firing through them. But I hope they can follow along. So you gave a great historical overview there, but I'm curious, like, do you have a sentence or two sentences in your head that you believe, based on all of that history and overview, that you think that is what mind is? Like what, like you gave a great kind of textbook definition there, but like, what do you think yourself?
What do I think myself? You know, well, I generally say today, I don't believe anything. I entertain ideas, right? Because the reason for that is I've got my preferences, which I'll go into in a second. But generally speaking, I don't think anyone can be certain about any of these things, right? And one of the reasons we can't be certain is because of this problem of privacy that I mentioned. You know, if elements of mind are not, if they cannot be observed, then how can we know? And then you get into epistemology, right? What is knowledge, right? How can we know things? You know things in mathematics without observation. But with philosophy of mind, or metaphysics of mind, I think we go for inference to best explanation. You know, what is the most plausible? What's the most parsimonious logically? What kind of resolves certain issues down the line, and so on. And also, I think a historical viewpoint is useful because you realize that what we take for granted today, you can sort of trace why people take these things for granted. And when you look at the origins, sometimes like a lot of, the current form becomes questionable. Interestingly, I think a lot of our current views of the mind stem from the Reformation 500 years ago, right, in Christianity. Anyway, what preference do I have? I did my PhD on panpsychism, but I'm I prefer Spinoza's, or a caveated form of Spinoza's theory. And Spinoza is a monist, like, you know, one substance. There's not, you know, as opposed to Descartes' two, mind, body, he's a monist, there's one substance. But that substance is deeper, richer than both mind and matter. So mind and matter are both expressions or attributes of that one deeper substance, which he argues humans are not privy to. We cannot actually know this. It's beyond our human possibilities. And I'm kind of, why am I sympathetic to monism? Well, it's very parsimonious, very logical. You know, it has fewer assumptions, and it does away with a lot of problems in mind studies. So, for example, the problem of how mind emerges from non-mind is not there because they're the same thing. Yeah. And for the downward causation, mental causation, it's not really a problem so much because, again, is not like a downward causation from one level to the next. They are one level. So you get psychophysical to psychophysical causation, one line of causation. So it resolves these kind of deep questions. And what I don't like about Spinozism, though, is that he's basically a fatalist or a determinist. So there's no free will there. Although there is mental causation or physical mental causation, there's no freedom. And I'm sort of more in line with Alfred North Whitehead, this British philosopher's thought here, where he allows for creativity for various reasons we can get into if you want. But yeah, so I suppose my natural tendency goes towards a kind of mixture of Spinoza and Whitehead's thought.
MindLab Pro is a scientifically backed nootropic designed to enhance memory and focus and keep you as mentally sharp as possible in 2026. And before you click off, it has been scientifically proven in not one, but 3 separate double-blind placebo-controlled trials that it really works. In one study, healthy adults took MindLab Pro for 30 days and improved on 3 separate information processing tasks. In another trial, adults improved on a set of memory tasks. The interesting part is in both trials, this improvement did not happen in the placebo group, which is a really strong piece of evidence that what is making the difference is in this bottle. MindLab Pro has no proprietary blends, complete transparency on ingredients, and has full third-party testing so you know exactly what's in the bottle. Performance Labs is one of the most scientifically rigorous supplement companies that exists, and that is the exact reason that I have decided to partner with them. I also take their sleep stack every single night, and they sell a bunch of other high quality supplements. They offer a 30-day money back guarantee, so there's literally zero risk in trying them out. You're supporting the giant shoulder by using the link in the description. Now back to the episode.
Yeah, it was so incredibly interesting. What I'm curious about is, so I was speaking to Dr. Robert Prentner, who is a colleague of Don Hoffman. So they've been working on these conscious agent theories, these ideas that the universe is built up from interactions of conscious agents. And we were talking about the intuitions that people have in if consciousness emerges from matter or matter emerges from consciousness. And I find it very funny that people can sort of take a lot of the same facts, and then someone might have an intuition that consciousness emerging from matter is harder or easier than matter emerging from consciousness. And I've always been a consciousness emerging from matter kind of guy. And I would say I'm also a monist. I'm not a dualist, so I think I can get around that as well. That I don't like saying that mind emerges from matter. I like saying that mind is the integration of information contained within matter. But I'm always been interested in what makes one brain want to believe consciousness is fundamental, and what makes another brain want to believe consciousness is biological.
Yeah, interesting question. I think you get into that history and politics really with that question rather than anything else.
Well, I find people that are philosophically grounded and sort of have philosophical training and sort of like the really abstract theorizing to generally tend towards consciousness being fundamental. But maybe people with more biological training are just wired to be like, of course, consciousness is biological.
Yeah, no, yeah. I think so. I mean, the view that consciousness is fundamental is idealism, which hasn't really been popular in Britain since 1925. And that's partly because, partly because of the two wars, the world wars, right? There was a real anti-German sentiment after the wars for good reason at the time. And Germans were generally associated with idealism because, especially through a philosopher, Hegel.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Hegel. So, well, let me. I try to situate this historically, and it's very fascinating. And I'm still looking into this. I mean, it's multifaceted, but it's quite so. Let's say over 200 years ago, late 1700s, Immanuel Kant brought about this, what he called the Copernican revolution in philosophy, right? Where he put mind at the center of things. And he said, listen, our knowledge is really limited because we have to perceive the world, including ourselves, in this particular way where we project things to understand things. Like I said, we project colors and sounds, but also space and time and causality as well. And even when we think about ourselves, we have got this limited way we project even upon ourselves. So we don't really even know our minds fully. My master's dissertation was on this, actually, the limits of self-consciousness in Kant and Schiller. Anyway, that philosophy was extremely influential. And even today, when you think about predictive processing theories of consciousness, I mean, this has got a Kantian origin. There's an essay on that, I think. There is an essay on that, actually, tracing that origin. So, this kind of more materialist today, that the brain produces the world that we see. Alan Seth is kind of TED talk about that and whatever. But it's Kantian, essentially. Transcendental idealism, it's called, or critical idealism. Anyway, historically, what happened is there was this kind of wish by these Germans, like Fichte, Schelling, and then Hegel, to say, actually, no, the implication of Kantianism is we don't know the world in itself, because to know means to project, right? So there was this, I would say, burning desire in Germany, what is now Germany, Jena especially, to say, no, we can know what the world is like in itself, right? And the culmination of this thought was Hegel. And he was a dialectical idealist. So he still believed that mind was fundamental, but that we did know what the world is in itself, and that because that world in itself is mental, just like we are, right? So it's a kind of pantheism. He denied he was a pantheist, but it's a type thereof, really. Anyway, Hegel was extremely influential his philosophy was very influential. It also kind of justified the Prussian state. And famously, it really inspired Karl Marx, who then had a massive effect on Western thought and politics. But he turned the dialectical idealism, into a dialectical materialism. That's a sort of radical metaphysical shift. But nonetheless, Hegel had a big influence on intellectual thought in the English-speaking world as well, with British idealism, and in America with the transcendentalists. And, like Nietzsche said, without Hegel, there'd be no Darwin. So Hegel's had this view of reality, which was a kind of progression, like we are progressing in society for logical reasons. And so you had a sort of basic evolutionary thought there that we are still in. And but nonetheless, this kind of idealism that Hegel was pushing, and that became very common, was linked to German philosophers. And then with the advent of the First and Second World Wars, there was a huge shift away from any kind of German thinking, because arguably it led to the war. I mean, Fichte was was an idealist, became a German nationalist, really, and wrote a book about it. And Karl Popper criticized Hegel heavily for being sort of leading to fascism and so on. So, I mean, this is debatable. I think it's unfair. But anyway, there was this sentiment. And so there was this push against idealism completely. And then materialism seeped through. So that was through the Marxism that I mentioned. And you get that in academia with like critical theory, it turned into critical theory and so on. But then in the analytic world, there was a push against Hegelism generally. So in the early 20th century, A.J. Ayer wrote an essay on the meaninglessness of metaphysics. Metaphysics was generally idealist then. And then of course, we stopped teaching it really at university, metaphysics. Idealism was never like logically refuted, but it became like unfashionable, right? And so we moved on, and then people were not trained in metaphysics. I mean, scientists originally, like Humphrey Davy, for example, who wrote, published a book in 1800, Nitrous Oxide. He considered himself a chemical philosopher. So, and the greatest scientists have always been interested in philosophy, like Einstein and Heisenberg and Schrödinger and so on. But generally, there was not much love for it. And it became a dirty word, metaphysics. And as a result, the 20th century and sort of all the brain sciences, neurosciences there, and generally all the sort of special sciences just moved away from metaphysics, except for one metaphysics. That's materialism. That's still a metaphysical point of view. And that was just assumed to be true. But, interestingly, there are a few philosophers of materialism, but it's debatable. It's very debatable. There's a lot of problems with it, just like all of them do. But that was one of the reasons why, like you said, you just assume that, the brain produces consciousness. And that the question is, like, how does it do that, right? But it's, you could go further and say, well, does it actually produce it, or is it, or does it receive it? If you go into even like more radical theories, right, from Bergson and so on. Or is the brain and the mind on an equally fundamental level? So neither produces the other, but they are both, like I said, expressions of something deeper still. All of these questions are still logically open. They haven't been determined, right? And so, like, I suppose I've just found like one of my roles in life has become to just like offer this metaphysical menu of possibilities, right?
And I love it. The history is so interesting, because I'd be completely put up my hands up and say I'm very ignorant to the history of philosophy. Again, my orientation is generally just biology and more hard science rather than the philosophy. So I'm learning so much. I didn't know any of that history. I think that's very, very interesting.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. I mean, the history becomes important for understanding science as well, and
Yes.
the hypotheses, the experiments one does, like they're based on like these deep, implicit, unspoken of metaphysical theories that are basically, they might be right. I'm not saying they're wrong, right? I'm just saying that they're open to question.
Yes.
And by questioning them, you can come up with new theories about, the mind. I mean, for example, why do we always only scan the brains when we're looking at consciousness, or not the whole body? There's this assumption of neuroessentialism generally.
I completely agree with that. Actually, that's one thing that's that's shifted for me throughout the podcast. Basically, since I spoke to Michael Levin, I think that I think the brain is maybe necessary for a particular complexity, a particular richness of consciousness. But I'm totally on board with like my kidney cells are conscious, the cells in my toes are conscious. They all make meaningful use of information in the environment and disambiguate noisy, complex information, self-generate their own meaning. I'm like on board that, you know, my pancreas has subjectivity. I totally, I think I used to be very much, you know, the brain creates consciousness. You just get a certain level of intricacy and complexity and then consciousness emerge. I don't think that's logically very consistent at all. You know, we have the most complex part of our brain is the cerebellum at the back and doesn't seem to be involved in consciousness at all. I think that's a really interesting point of fact against just like this emergentism. But I'm like fully on board with like very, very, very early on biological systems evolved consciousness, like extremely primitive systems. But I'm still not quite more radical than that. Like I think you would take a couple of steps more radical than that. And that's what I'm really curious in understanding why. I think
Well,
I've also. Sorry, go.
Sounds like you're almost a panpsychist then. I mean, you're probably what I'd call a biopsychist, right?
But I would say, like, I think instead of saying that, you know, fundamental particles and the universe have subjective experience, I do think that subjective experience and consciousness emerges early on in the integration of an organism's state in relation to its environment, and then integrating that environmental stimulus in relation with its own memory. Like last time I moved towards this stimulus, I got food, so I fed myself. That's great, but I'm sensing this other chemical over here, and there's a predator, so I have to integrate those two signals together, and I'm integrating with the memory that I have of those two signals plus my own body's state. Like, I think consciousness is a biological control system fundamentally. And
right. In which case you believe in mental causation then, right? Because it has to do something, otherwise it wouldn't exist, right?
I mean, absolutely. Yeah, I don't buy this epiphenomenon nonsense. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Like if you believe in emergent mental causation, downward causation, then that causes this massive problem with upward causation as well, that emergence, which is made clear in something called the exclusion problem. We could talk about, but yeah, okay. Let's. So yeah, so are you an integrated information theorist then? I guess.
So I really like aspects of it. I really consciousness just being integrated information, I think is great. I think that I like that a lot. I don't think I fully understand everything that theory states, but I like the idea that consciousness is integrated information. I've always been on board with that, and the fact that you can maybe measure it with this number called phi is super interesting. And they're trying to work out different ways of quantifying consciousness based on how integrated the information is. I think there's a lot of really promising stuff there. Am I on board with it completely? I guess I would say that I don't understand it fully to say that or not.
And there's different versions every year, more or less, you know. So even if you understood it now, next year there'll be a new version of it. But okay, generally speaking, yeah. So yeah, I mean, you know, I don't think we're that far apart then, really. But I'll say, let's talk about like, okay, so integrated information generally. So a cell has it, you know, and so on. You know, in the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, who's sort of founder of process philosophy, also his theories are the origin really of epigenetics for metaphysical reasons. But his philosophy is called the philosophy of organism because essentially he argues there's no real distinction between an organism and an inorganic entity like a molecule, right? There's no cutoff point. So when you talk about like, you know, a cell can sort of integrate information, amoeba cell perhaps or something like that. How about like a protein molecule within a neuron cell, you know, the kinesin, is it pronounced kinesin, the ones that walk on tubes?
Yeah.
I mean, they also react to the environment. They activate, you know, things like this, right? And when you look at them, animations of them, they look like little guys walking along, right? Don't they?
Yeah.
Right? But anyway, just to finish my point, you know, so that's a molecule. And, you know, we have so-called organic molecules, but the cutoff point between an organic molecule and let's say a non-organic molecule is really arbitrary, it seems. So because a molecule also kind of reacts to the environment and maintains itself, you know, perseveres in itself and tries to reach a state of equilibrium and so on, you know, okay, it doesn't reproduce and so on, but nonetheless, It has self-sufficient structure to it to a certain extent. And so if you're attributing consciousness to very basic life forms, why not go further? Where would the cutoff point be?
Yeah,
this
it's a
would be
great, absolutely. It's a great question, and I'm super glad that I've been really interested in this, where exactly the cutoff point is, and I don't have a good answer for it. I really don't. Like, I think the earliest way I think about how something integrates a signal is that it probably operates on like a rule-based heuristic, like move towards sun, good, and then we'll always do that. And eventually rule-based becomes non-rule-based, and that's like a vague continuum, and I don't have a good answer on like necessarily one after the other, 'cause it
I don't
just,
think anyone else,
but I think it's
you know,
super interesting.
it is, isn't it? And but the thing is, if you kind of imagine that organisms go all the way down, as it were, this is Leibniz's old view as well, really. Then why not just grant consciousness all the way down as well? If things are integrated all the way down, even at the atomic level, why not attribute a very basic form of consciousness to that?
Well,
Why?
does an electron?
So why must there be a cutoff point? This is the interesting question.
So Panpsychism says that a singular electron is conscious, right? It has some level of mind.
Yeah, generally speaking, like there are many types of panpsychism, but yeah, okay, I'll grant you that.
So what kind of, integrated signal and, subjectivity do you think a single electron is having?
Well, I mean, an electron, I don't think even physicists really understand what it is, so I'm not going to be careful what I say here, right?
Yes.
It's a wave and a particle, isn't it? I mean, and maybe that's just a model of it. But it does obviously sense the nucleus of an atom, doesn't it? The proton and the neutron. And it does react accordingly. And it will also react to streams coming in, electricity of other electrons, moving it on and so on, So it has got these rules, as you say, of interaction.
I guess I just don't know enough about it. Yeah.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, nor do I. And the reason is neither of us are physicists, particle physicists, right? But I believe that even physicists at the basic level don't really understand,
Yeah.
like what, and there are physicists who differ with one another about it. And when you go into quantum physics, which I try to avoid at all costs, people just say, if you think you understand it, you don't understand it. And also just the question of the issue of energy, what energy is. I mean, most physicists will say we don't know what it is. We can model it, put it into equations and stuff, but we don't know what it fundamentally is.
Yeah.
So the questions of consciousness really, are fully interwoven into questions of physics. Like to get out this question about, how far down do you go? Well, then you need to know about these particular particles or these entities. And maybe in the future, we won't even have the concept of an electron. Maybe it will be superseded by something else.
Yes.
So you have to. I suppose we all have to kind of admit our limitations, understand that science does progress or change at least, and hopefully we'll get insights later on down the line. So that's why I kind of say I don't believe anything deeply, but I kind of entertain the idea. I think it's like if you say that consciousness exists throughout the universe and didn't emerge, you get rid of problems. Like I said, you get rid of this problem of like the emergence of consciousness from non-consciousness. This is a really big problem, and you get rid of these problems of upward and downward causation and things like this. It's nothing. I mean, it's nothing really. I don't think it's that radical at all. It's just a belief in evolution, at all levels. And also, just one other aspect of all this, which I started with, the concept of matter. Electrons supposed to be a part of matter. We don't really know what matter is. Like I said, same matter energy is supposed to be the same thing, and we don't really understand what it is. So we have to be humble, and then so we have to understand that we can't know that consciousness emerges out of non-consciousness.
Yes.
Because we can't know that there is something non-conscious, fundamentally. So that's why I think all the options are open, and then you have to go. If people push you like you're pushing me, then you have to you can take a position and defend it, but you can never be certain about
it. I think I've always somewhat conflated panpsychism and idealism. Like, is maybe differentiate those two? Like, does panpsychism make the argument that consciousness is fundamental, or just that everything is conscious?
Yeah, the latter. So
So it's not a consciousness as fundamental theory.
it can be, but it doesn't need to be. So
Right.
I've got this 2023 paper called On the Need for Metaphysics and Psychedelic Therapy and Research. And in it, there's a metaphysics matrix. So it's got like, it's got columns of physicalism, dualism, idealism, monism, and the transcendent, but then a row of panpsychism cutting across, because panpsychism can be any of those. It's kind of
Right.
like, it wears many guises. So you do get idealist versions of panpsychism, for example, from Schopenhauer. But you also get physicalist versions of panpsychism. So Galen Strawson, who was actually my PhD examiner, he's someone who really pushed panpsychism into the public eye, I think, about 15, 20 years ago, because he was like hard-nosed analytic British philosopher. His father was a famous philosopher, Peter Strawson, and he suddenly argued for this identity form of panpsychism, but he calls it real materialism. And he says he's a complete naturalist. And he even argues that this is what materialism used to be. And actually, you do find it with Francis Bacon, people like that, like originators of the scientific age. So you get material. So he just says, no, I'm a pure materialist. I just believe that matter has elements of consciousness within it, So it's just what one more feature, like charge or spin. So you can define yourself that way. You can get dualist panpsychists as well. So in a way, every entity has a kind of like a psyche attached to it, as it were, which doesn't depend on the body. This is rare, though, and perhaps this is more akin to how we understand animism, from the Americas. Like, tree has a spirit, river has a spirit, and so on. And then there are idealist versions. So everything is a mind, and the whole of reality is mental. But this is, a view of Leibniz, for example, arguably, but it's not necessary. And then you get like the monist version that I kind of prefer, which is that, mind and matter, both expressions of something more fundamental. But that means that every manifestation of matter has to have this parallel mentality to it. That's kind of, panpsychism. But it's not mind and matter are not fundamental to reality. They're both expressions of something deeper still that we don't understand. And also, I should say, panpsychism is often confused with pantheism, which is the view that all is God. So this is the view upwards, as it were. So that's the view that there's a cosmic consciousness. The whole universe has this kind of basic background radiation consciousness. Not a personal God. So it's not. Spinoza says God does not love you, right? God doesn't care about you in this kind of pantheism, or cosmopsychism is another word for it today, really. But you can be a panpsychist and not a cosmopsychist. So you can think that, yes, like you were saying, you need entities with integrated information, like organisms, for consciousness. But, the cosmos doesn't have that as a whole. So we begin at the highest level would be human or alien or whatever exists out there. But some kind of biological organism would be the highest view, and then you go down. Whereas cosmopsychists say, no, this is just on a rung on the ladder to the ultimate cosmic consciousness, and we are parts of that. But that's not panpsychism necessarily. You can be both, but you don't have to be.
I didn't know that there were so many flavors to it. I remember having my one lecture in consciousness in my entire neuroscience degree, and I think panpsychism was given maybe a 3-minute monologue on there's no evidence for it, don't even look at it. I actually remember my professor kind of saying very much along those lines, like it was not given even remotely the time of day.
That's kind of sad, I think. But also, I must say, when I was a philosophy undergraduate and postgraduate, same. We were told this is almost like if your theory reaches panpsychism, that's disproof of the theory. That's reductio ad absurdum, right? So, we were never taught the history of it. But there are historical reasons for that. Like I mentioned, with regard to the war, a lot of the idealists were more sympathetic to panpsychism. But there's another big factor that I sort of hinted at the beginning, which is the Reformation. So, the Western world, in the early 1500s, we went through the Reformation with Luther, against the Roman Catholic Church, and this led to, Lutheranism, Calvinism, but also like the extreme form was Puritanism, and the Puritans wanted to, and which, by the way, became big in America. They were kind of shunned from England and Britain, but they set up home in America. But this is what the Puritans wanted to do, and a number of Protestants really, is to get rid of any pagan elements within Christianity. And they thought Roman Catholicism had had integrated many pagan elements. Ronald Hutton argues this as well. He says paganism survived through medieval Christianity, like they didn't just reject it, they just assimilated it into the religion. But the reformers, they wanted to get rid of all elements of paganism from church. And so what they did is they even saw the Aristotelianism, which is like not quite panpsychism, but it's, there's a vegetative soul and so on, right, in Aristotle. They wanted to get rid of all of those pagan elements, all of these old European animist elements. So there was, there's a spirit to the tree and so on. And just say that we only go by the Bible, right? Sola Scriptura. Nothing else is true. So they got rid of all that mentality within nature. And then, next century, Descartes comes along and says, yeah, like actually all of nature is completely unensouled. There's no consciousness in it at all. In fact, only humans have consciousness. That's through the soul, right? And this was very influential. So then the church took care of the soul, saving the soul, and what became science took care of nature, but now understood in from this Protestant perspective of being devoid of consciousness. And this is actually an early Christian bifurcation of nature, which Descartes crystallized, but it had, he was actually a Roman Catholic, but nonetheless, that was the zeitgeist. And this is one of the reasons I think why probably in neuroscience today, you just sort of look at panpsychism for a few minutes and then move on quickly.
I've heard you talk about how psychedelics can help us peel back the layers of reality, kind of get a deeper understanding of what's really down there. Can you talk about that? Like, what can psychedelics reveal about consciousness and reality?
Well, there's a number of things really, and I think on the whole, there's two ways to approach it. I think they can give insights into consciousness generally from a negative point of view, and also they might be able to, if one is open to metaphysical possibilities, then psychedelics can give you an experiential view of these possibilities. So where to start? I mean, number one, psychedelics just reveal to us how powerful the mind can be. I mean, shocking ways. If you've never taken them, well, you'd be quite amazed because they are far beyond imagination, far beyond dreams or nightmares. The visuals, the complexity of the visuals of like beings, entities, spaceships. All kinds of things are just. It's just, number one, shocking. And so if you are interested in consciousness, it almost behoves you to look into psychedelic consciousness. Because it's just a data set, it's just a whole new world of mentality, which otherwise, I mean, there are all these kind of stereotypes about, LSD just causing kind of, like these kind of circular visions and multicolored spirals and so on. And that's, it's a very small part of something greater. And most of it, well, a lot of it, you can't even put into words, it's famously ineffable. So you can have another really interesting thing in relation to consciousness is this: you can have experiences that you cannot classify into the modes of experience that we generally have. So
yes,
you can have experiences which are not concepts, or they're not percepts, they're not colors or sounds or scents or whatever. Yet they're not emotions or feelings, they're not moods, they're not the subconscious drives. There's something completely different, but at the same time, very intense.
Yes.
Bizarre. Very intense, but of course you can't express it in words because we haven't created words for these kind of non-prosaic states. That in itself is interesting because, I don't know, for example, Jaegwon Kim, this great philosopher of mind, died a few years ago. He said, like, why do we have these qualia and not others? This remains a mystery, right? So why do we have, like, for electromagnetism, why do we have color? Why not sound or smell? Or for airwaves, why do we have sound? Why not something else? And then, but we do have colors, let's say for electromagnetic frequencies, or for movement in the visual cortex, or all of it combined. But why colors for things? Why not something completely different, so long as it makes practical life operational? So if we can navigate the world, you don't necessarily need to see it in terms of colors. Maybe other creatures don't. But anyway, so psychedelics kind of show you these other possibilities. Very, very fascinating. But it's hard to remember them even because you can't latch onto them, concepts or words and so on. In the negative sense, psychedelics kind of rule out a number of theories of consciousness. So, much of the 20th century was beholden to this theory of behaviorism, in psychology, with Skinner, and in philosophy, logical behaviorism with Ryle and people like that. And it's the view that there's no such thing as consciousness, really. Really, all consciousness is, or a mental state, is simply behavior of some kind. So happiness is smiling, But you take a few magic mushrooms and lie down, and you don't move at all, you don't behave at all, but you travel galaxies and meet aliens and whatever, right? So it kind of sort of, I think, disproves that theory quite radically. Also, there's interesting issues about multiple realization with psychedelics. So multiple realization means that the same mental state can be realized in different ways, so you probably know about this more than I do, but so have you ever heard of the Lorber case? This case of this math student who didn't have a brain but just functioned normally and could see and so on.
No, I don't think the specific case, but I've always been fascinated with these.
Yeah, but you said they didn't have, the prefrontal cortex or anything, visual cortex or anything like this. They had a thin film of neurons on the underside of their skull, but nonetheless, their mental functionings were realized in different ways, right? So somehow, and hunger. The classic example of philosophy is that hunger can be realized in multiple ways. So in humans, it sort of relates presumably to something within our brains and body, but in an octopus, something very different. But you wouldn't want to deny hunger to an octopus, right? This is Hilary Putnam's argument against identity theory. But so with psychedelics, you can have like very qualitatively similar experiences, but with drugs that act in very different ways on the brain. So you have a lot of the classic psychedelics act on serotonin receptors, but salvia divinorum, for example, doesn't. Acts in a very different way, but yet the experiences are somewhat similar, which is in itself quite fascinating. And perhaps reveals kind of, necessary and sufficient conditions of human consciousness. Also, another interesting aspect of consciousness research with regard to psychedelics is that in relation to Huxley and Bergson. So, in one of the reasons that Westerners became interested in psychedelics in the 20th century, after James in the early 20th century, was with Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, where he takes mescaline and then writes about it and tries to understand it through a philosophical frame, many frames really. But what Huxley does is he uses his French philosopher Henri Bergson, his radical theory of consciousness, to understand his mescaline experience. And Bergson's theory basically is that perception is to use Huxley's term, a reducing valve or a filter. So, what we see is just really a small fragment of what's out there. We've evolved a certain way to see just, like the colors that are useful to us, but we don't see ultraviolet red. I think most people accept this today. But what Bergson argued more controversially was that the brain doesn't create these colors and sounds either. It receives them from out there. So colors actually are out there, which for many people sounds obvious, right? The grass is actually green. For a philosopher and a neuroscientist, imagine that's a controversial statement, right?
Yes.
The greenness is rather, the general idea, as you know, is, electromagnetism, light hits the eye, goes to the visual cortex, and then somehow magically emerges, right, as a color. But for Bergson, the color is actually out there, and we absorb that color into us when we look. And so here's a question for you, actually, right? And I work with neuroscientists like Leo Roseman at Exeter and Alex Shaw and people like that. Anyway, we had for our student, we got an MSc in psychedelics. It's called Psychedelics, Mind, Medicine, and Culture, actually. So we do look at consciousness in relation to this. I explained the Bergson's filter theory of consciousness. We filter out mind at large, what he calls mind at large. So mind is out there. We filter a small fraction for our trickle of consciousness here. But it sort of means that the brain doesn't generate consciousness, but receives it, or at least receives mental states. How could you devise an experiment to test this very basic difference? Does the brain generate or receive consciousness? Right? You think something that basic would be testable, but actually it turns out not to. I mean, I've got hope that there is a way of testing it. Actually,
Yeah.
it would be a really interesting experiment, but it's not immediately obvious how that would be done.
No, it's not. Like,
So that's the thing that, that as you ask, what does psychedelics bring to the state of consciousness? That's not an interesting question, right? So,
yeah, I've so much to say on everything that you said there, and I absolutely love it. One thing that you might be very interested in is I've done this process of experience sampling. So this was developed by a psychologist called Russell Hurlburt in like the 1970s to basically try and get at subjective experience. So I've been carrying around this box that was literally, made 55 years ago with one purpose of I'll turn it on and it will beat me 6 times per day. And I will write down my experience in that moment. So I was thinking about these things. I had this image in my mind of a castle and a lawn and a wall, and I have to write down exactly what I saw. So you're really trying to get at the aspects of experience, and it's a really hard process. For one, like you said, like we just don't have words for most of these things. Like I was feeling euphoria in my body, but like yeah, it just doesn't really match. Like that's sort of what it feels like, but it doesn't really match. So I did that for 10 weeks to get at my experience. But the part that you might be very interested in is that I did one sampling session on LSD. And I found that it was totally impossible. Like it was just entirely impossible to get at what was happening in any way. The language just didn't work. Like the only way I could say it that in any language was like every single cell in my body was vibrating with positive euphoria and energy, and it was excited in an emotional way on a cellular level, and I could feel it sort of radiating from like a central core all the way down like a gradient to all of my different limbs and everything. But it was like I could feel the excitement in every single cell. And I kind of realized that even that might be some aspects of that that are kind of roughly true, but the language none of it fit. And it was so hard to do. And I was so unconfident writing down. I was like, I don't know, like the plant was sort of like an octopus in a strange way, but it doesn't work. And I was trying to explain this to 2 neuroscientists that have never done psychedelics. And they were like really pleased with my results, being like, oh yeah, I think we described your experience. And I was like, guys, I don't think we got at it at all. Like it's just so the language just doesn't do it justice. It's so hard. There isn't a word for these things. Like even I think in a normal sober state, there isn't even words for these things. And then you go and psychedelics just explode every dimension of human experience into like 1,000 extra dimensions that you didn't even know existed. And then and then you try and put a word on it, it's like, nah, that word just doesn't do it justice. It might be the best word, but it's still so far away from that experience.
Yeah, I mean, William James said mystical states are ineffable, right? Exactly that. Well, also actually Humphrey David did. But it brings along another interesting intellectual point, which is that to get to understand what's going on in the brain, right? You need a good phenomenology and good taxonomy of states, right? And then so someone says, I'm experiencing this now, and then you sort of, you correlate that to the fMRI or whatever it is. But if you haven't got words for it, you can't express it, right? And then therefore you can't find the correlates either.
So he tries to break these phenomena down into these 5 frequent phenomena. And he kind of doesn't like the framework because it chunks experience together, right? You like have an experience and then you're kind of forced to like squish it into a label. And I think they're roughly correct, but it still doesn't work. But then if you don't have labels for anything, like how do you develop a science? Like how do you actually develop a field? How do you make any claims or do anything ever if you can't actually say that this thing was this label? No label feels right, but then like I genuinely don't know how you make progress in a field when every attempt to put a label on it just doesn't work.
No, you're right. I mean, there are questionnaires which try, but they always are inadequate. There's something called microphenomenology, which sort of tries to really get it stops you every 10 minutes when you're on the trip and says, "What you're feeling now, write it down in detail." But even that, I feel that probably affects the trip in a negative way.
Yeah.
And even then, it's using words, right? So it will never be fully adequate. And if you believe in the ineffability of certain psychedelic experiences, then you'll never ever be able to report it perfectly. But maybe you can get closer, so you can get, like you're saying already, like broad swathes, so, at least kind of give you some information. Um, but yeah, no, it's difficult to study. I mean, it's difficult to study the mind for the reasons of privacy, like I mentioned, but psychedelic mind even more so. And at the same time, though, you don't need to understand exactly how things work in order to create medicines, right? So, like general anesthetic, we don't really understand how that works, but we do use it. And the same with psychedelics. So, they are now being used as medicines in the West, and we've got a Home Office license to use them, even to experiment with them. So, they are in progress, and the law's changing. So, regardless of all these things,
Not changing fast enough, in my opinion, and I think you would
no, no.
agree. But
No, but it is changing, and drug science are doing. David Nutt's organization is doing good work in Britain on it. But I mean, cannabis has been a prescription drug for the last few, 6 years, and people don't even know it's a prescription drug. I think there's only 6 NHS outlets in the whole of Britain for that.
yeah,
Where the law's changed. So most people think it's just still illegal, and yeah, psychedelics will take a while, but I think we're getting there. But another interesting point that brings up, well, I mentioned this kind of alien qualia before. How many experiences are possible for a human being? If you have all these crazy experiences that you mentioned that you can write down, what is the limit? Is there a limit? Is there a limit, or is the mind infinite
I
in
would
its
I would
capacity?
I would say near infinite, because I think every experience starts in context, right? I've never spoken with you before, so this is a completely unique experience. I know, like, there's a lot of common features in that you're, a very intelligent person that I've had enjoying this conversation with, and I do that a lot. But I've never had an experience of speaking to you before, so in that sense, it is completely unique. And I think just
Okay, yeah,
the combinatorial permutations of the biological system contribute to our experience in some way, and there's just a near infinite ways that they can be like that they can come together. Like,
yeah.
I think there's 8 billion flavors of human experience, that no two are the same at all.
Something that always strikes me when I talk to neuroscientists is just how staggeringly complex the brain really is. It's this incredible prediction engine, always trying to make sense of the world and keep us safe. But it's important to remember we're still running ape hardware. Our brains weren't even remotely built for the chaos of modern life, and sometimes they just get scrambled. I've recently had some difficulty in my own personal life, and I realized that it was about time my own ape prediction system got the gym workout and just rebalancing that it's probably needed for quite a long time. So I booked my first therapy session with BetterHelp, who I'm incredibly excited to be partnering with on this video. A massive umbrella review of hundreds of randomized control trials found that nearly every meta-analysis of psychotherapy favored it over control conditions. In other words, mental health professionals from decades of research consistently find that talking therapies do actually work. BetterHelp is an entirely online therapy platform designed to make that process incredibly simple. You can connect with a licensed therapist from your home on your schedule through video, audio, or even text with literally no fuss at all. What I like about it is that you can switch therapists at any time until you find someone who you personally can build rapport with and open up to, which is such a critical part of therapy, at no extra cost. If you've ever thought about trying therapy, or you're just feeling a little bit stuck in your own head lately like I was, this might be a great first step that I really couldn't recommend more. Visit betterhelp.com/giantshoulder to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp/giantshoulder, and in doing so, you also support the channel. Links are down below, because sometimes the most powerful way to understand your own brain is just to talk about it.
Mm. I suppose, yeah, when you meet, every experience is new, right? Even if it's the same, it will be new in your life in relation to your memory. But I wonder if, at least like when you meet me now online here, I mean, you're still using kind of, colors and sounds and whatever, right? Which you are familiar with, at least the types. But I wonder how far mind can go in terms of like different types, like I mentioned, like different types of experience that we just are generally not aware of at all. Is that infinite? I mean, if you're a Platonist, you'd say it is infinite. That these types exist out there, like with the Pythagorean theorem, this strange sort of timeless realm that we sometimes ingress. That's when you get this other form of theory of mind that you perceive not only the things that are outside of you, but you add types from this eternal realm. And you get into Plato there, but also a lot of logicians believe that, like Frege and Gödel, and the basis of his incompleteness theorems, and Whitehead and early Russell. But yeah, no, they are deep metaphysical questions. I mean, people have been arguing about these, like, do people discover or invent mathematical truths? Right, has been debated for 3,000 years.
Yeah.
And I think Psychedelics bring back that debate to a certain extent. Also, you touched upon something there, context. I mean, this is another interesting debate which psychedelics brings to consciousness studies, which is, people like Huxley and William James, they believe that in perennialism, there's this peak experience which is qualitatively identical amongst all peoples at all times, universalism, as it were. And this is opposed to contextualism, which is the view that actually not just the interpretation, but the very experience itself is completely dependent upon one's context.
Yes.
Someone in the British Isles will, have some kind of monotheistic experience. Perhaps someone in the jungle in America will experience something very different. And it's an ongoing debate. It started really in the 70s with Stephen Katz, but psychedelics have brought it back. There's a great paper on it by Kurt Beyer, actually. But yeah, is the mind completely dependent on its context, or is there some kind of universality to it? Interesting question. How would you prove it one way or the other? There's a third way probably as well, which I'm sort of more, favorable towards. But what psychedelics generally do, I think, is that they're like almost like, let's say, a kind of star about which all of these questions of consciousness revolve. They kind of I don't think psychedelics experience necessarily proves anything, but brings into play all of these different issues.
That's
interesting.
That's what I struggle with psychedelics in separating fact from fiction, right? Because I've experienced, or again, what I experienced as universal consciousness is almost definitely is different than your experience of universal consciousness. But say they might have some commonalities in feature, like this connectedness with the world, a rich connectedness with nature, a wanting to donate money to save the red pandas, whatever it is. There's some connectedness there. But then at the same time, I saw my plant turning into an octopus. So it's like what feels like a true universal consciousness, and I think maybe what pushes some people towards these radical ideas of consciousness, I think I've experienced in some way, although there's definitely differences. But then, like, how do you separate that fact from fiction, from the fact that your plant is now waving at you, or I even just saw a tweet today from Paul Stamets that there's this mushroom that they're trying to find in Papua New Guinea that's causing these Lilliputian hallucinations. These fascinating, interesting psychedelic effect that has like these little, people see these tiny like figurines kind of running around, and we don't really know why people seem to have these hallucinations, and it seems to operate. Yeah.
Yeah,
why the hell is that?
Well, this Chinese community found mushrooms and saw little people, and of course you get it in the Amerindian cultures as well. The Shapiri, for example, the Yanomami people and so on, little beings, entities, and of course with DMT, little elves, jokers.
Exactly. I was going to bring up the DMT elves as well. Like, how do you separate fact from fiction here? Are these little people at some deeper bedrock of reality? Are the mischievous mechanical DMT elves at the bedrock of reality, or is it all just hallucinations the whole way down?
Well, there's a deep epistemic issue, right? And I'm open-minded about all of this. I don't know the answer, but I'll just preface this with two things. First of all, certainly psychedelics do induce hallucinations at the least, but that doesn't mean they're not they're always delusions, just like normal perception. Generally, we think we're seeing the real world, but every now and again you think you see a friend, but it's actually someone else, It's
Yep.
very common. The delusions in our everyday perceptions. And that doesn't mean, therefore, when I look at this book over here, it's a delusion as well, right? So that's one just core logical point. The other important point really is that the word delusion or hallucination is relative to the concept reality. And we can only say something's a delusion if we know what reality is.
Yeah, true.
And as we've been speaking, we've realized, well, I've realized, well, we both know already, but that there is massive disagreement on what reality is, in
Yes.
terms of how matter relate, And so without knowing that, you can't really definitively say that something's a delusion. Obviously, the probability, of flying pandas in front of your face, as being delusions. But there are other aspects, like, for example, more classical mystical states where you think that your ego, yourself, dissolves and you sort of immerse into a larger consciousness. I mean, this is not obviously a delusion if you look at certain thought like Spinoza, that there's this, infinite intellect, or even like extended mind theories, which are doing the rounds today, that our consciousness is not dependent just on our brain, nervous system, and body, but also with the external things in our environment. There's this, in other words, there's really physical correlates of consciousness rather than neural or even biological correlates of consciousness, arguably. But anyway, so and these things change, our understandings change, fashions change, and so you have to be open-minded with these deeper questions about psychedelic consciousness, I think, generally. So idealism, everything's conscious, or pantheism, panpsychism, nature connectedness. There are good reasons, intellectually, to believe in these things. So they're not obviously delusions. And that's just another important point to say, that you can study metaphysics intellectually, like reading Spinoza, or you can experience them. So you get intellectual metaphysics and experiential metaphysics. Deleuze, the French philosopher, said with regard to Spinoza's monism, he said you can spend years studying the conceptual apparatus of Spinoza, or you can get it in a flash, like an intuition like that, right? Two different ways of perhaps the same truth.
Right.
But Lilliputians, yeah, this is something that
it's utterly bizarre, isn't it? It's utterly totally bizarre. And they don't
really,
they don't seem to be able to know what they can't find the mushroom or the psychoactive compound, and they think it might be a separate mechanism than the standard, more traditional psilocybin route. I think they don't know, and there might be some disagreement on this. But that would mean that mushrooms themselves independently evolved different ways to get us into psychedelic states, which is just, again, kind of utterly bizarre. Like, what do mushrooms, why are they doing this? It's and the fact that there's consistency in these Lilliputian hallucinations and the DMT elves is also just super interesting to me. Like, why on earth would that be?
It's really interesting. I listened to my friend Andrew Gallimore on Joe Rogan a few weeks ago. He speaks about he's a computational neurobiologist who's created this DMT X machine where you get constant injections of DMT, for the fuller experience.
Wow.
It's very often elvish or insectoid or some kind of beings, but it's a strange thing actually, that sometimes these beings come to you, these jokers or elves or whatever, and there was one instance where they said, right, that's it, you've had enough, and then the participants' experience just stopped, even though the DMT was being constantly pumped in, strangely. Here's another interesting question about psychedelics with regard to consciousness, mental causation again, right? So there are these groups trying to develop so-called pseudodelics, right? So they've got this molecular structure, base structure of a psychedelic molecule, but without the phenomenology, without the experience. So they believe that the therapeutic potential of a psychedelic is purely physiological.
All right.
Physical causation. And, I think it's marketable because some people, want to, lose their depression, but they don't want to go to outer space or something, right? Kind of understandable. But the interesting question there is, well, isn't the experience actually the therapeutic mechanism?
I think the data says it is. I've spoken to experts here where they do these mystical experience questionnaires, and the parts of the mystical experience that are best correlated with the alleviation of depressive symptoms are mystical experiences, and they're more tightly correlated than any of the other experiential dimensions that you possibly can list down in these questionnaires. I think the data
Yeah.
would support the fact that the experience is the crucial part.
Data and anecdote. You meet people who've had this one-off amazing experience and changed their lives, right, in terms of mental health benefits. But so it does seem that the experience itself is the mechanism. But that would be an example of mental causation, wouldn't it? You know, that you have an experience that then has physical effects on your body, ultimately over time.
But I don't know
And
how you could not believe in mental causation. Like, I don't understand what even, like, how could our mental states not impact our physiology and state and consciousness in a sort of in a loop way? I don't even understand what the alternative to that is.
right. Well, yeah, funny you say that there as a neuroscientist, because you know, like most neuroscientists I've met are methodological epiphenomenalists, right? They don't really believe in mental causation. They think that everything ultimately is the causation is on the physical level, and by physical they mean you know, pure matter without mind. Why is that a problem? I mean, because a lot of people don't want to believe in mental causation, which is not exactly the same thing as free will, because you can get determined mental causation. But a lot of people don't want to believe in it because it would be a force of nature which we do not understand. So it's not gravity, electromagnetism, strong or weak nuclear force, right? It would be something separate from that. And that would break like the conservation of energy principles and causal closure and et cetera, et cetera. So the belief, you know, like a sort of dogmatic materialist would want to say, no, all causation is matter to matter. You know, there can't be mental causation. There can't be this woo stuff that comes down and affects us. And a lot of people do argue this, and they're epiphenomenalists. But on the other side, you've got the evolutionists, the biologists, other scientists who are saying, no, for evolutionary reasons. So Karl Popper argued this, for example, as did F.H. Bradley, William James, and many others. Whitehead. For evolutionary reasons, consciousness must have a function. You know,
Yes.
why did we evolve consciousness? Why did other species evolve consciousness? Presumably, if it doesn't do anything, you know, and even if it was like a vestigial organ, it would have done something in the past. You do get spandrels in evolution, like the chin, human chin, which like seem to serve no purpose, but they are a species specific, like, and humans have it, right? If you got chins throughout every species, you wonder, like, okay, why is nature giving a chin to birds and stuff? You're suspicious for some function, wouldn't you, right? So the same with consciousness. Surely, and over, you know, just for logical reasons, surely you think human intelligence has had an effect on the world, you know, created cities, technology, science, or like our desires for a cup of tea, you know, has some kind of, not total, but partial causal, is a causal factor of me drinking my tea, for example, right?
It has to.
Or meditation or perception, you know, perceiving like red berries amongst the green is obviously very effective, right? So there's very good reasons to believe in mental causation, but how that fits in with physical causation in the body is the part of the exclusion problem, it's called. So there's many ways out of it. You could just say, well, science doesn't understand causation fully, number one, or you could say there is no mental causation, like an epiphenomenalist, or you could say there's no consciousness, right, like an eliminativist. Or my preferred, and this is one of the reasons why I am panpsychist, really, I'm honest, is because you say, well, actually, there's not mental to physical causation, psychophysical causation. If you're a monist, there's no up and down, there's no upstairs and downstairs. There's just one level, one floor, and there's just lateral causation there, and that then sort of resolves that issue. So all physical causation is also mental causation.
Yeah.
But that you're biting the bullet, and then you have to get into, like, you know, this kind of radical, what, you know, ramifies into panpsychism, essentially. Yeah. But this is one of the reasons I believe it, right? Because it resolves issues like this.
Super interesting. I might be a panpsychist by the end of this conversation. I can't tell, or radically close to it every minute.
My work is done then, right?
How do you think we can study panpsychism in a scientifically rigorous way? Like, how do we do it in such a way where scientists don't give it 3 minutes in the consciousness slide in the lecture to third years and just say, like, there's no evidence for this, don't even look it up, I'm not even barely going to give you a definition for it? Like, how do we give credibility to the field that it's not woo-woo spirituality? There's actually very good reasons to believe in panpsychism,
Yeah, well, the first thing I say is, like, what do you mean by evidence? Because there's no evidence for materialism either. There's no evidence for emergentism. This is woo, just as woo stuff, that the brain generates consciousness. Where's the evidence? You see correlation, but you see, that also applies to panpsychism, because I would be conscious in the panpsychist theory.
Yes.
So that's number one. It cuts both ways. Secondly, with evidence, we have to realize that what does evidence generally mean? In a scientific concept, it means empirical observation. And if you accept, now if, as an if here, if you accept, as I mentioned, that mind has an aspect that is private, first-person accessed, then empirical observation is inadequate, but not useless, but inadequate to fully understand these metaphysical positions, right? Physicalism or panpsychism. Or, like I said, Strawson says physicalism. Panpsychism is physicalism, so it confuses it further. And then thirdly, here's the core crucial point, which I think pertains to the dogma of a lot of contemporary science. There's a proposition. The proposition is the brain is necessary and sufficient for consciousness. That is a proposition. Where's the evidence for that?
Yeah.
But there is no evidence for that. Not to say that it's not true. I believe you need a human brain for human consciousness.
Yes.
I don't think you need a human brain for consciousness generally. So where's the evidence for that? There is no evidence because again, privacy, you can't become like a plant, for example, and you can't feel what a plant feels. Well, maybe you can. there's radical theory called perspectivism. But let's not go there. But generally, if you accept the privacy of the mind, and some people don't, but if you do, then you can't prove that statement that of neuroessentialism, that the brain is necessary and sufficient for consciousness. And thus you have to, logic is just pure logic. It's nothing to do with religion or new age spirituality or anything like that, right? Pure logic.
Yeah.
And you have to be open-minded to its possibility as
I agree.
on a footing with physicalism.
It's why I love having these conversations. The radical becomes slightly less radical, in some ways a lot more radical, but some clarity is gained. And even on the you need a human brain to have human consciousness, I remember speaking to Mark Solms, and there is case studies of people that basically they've no neocortex. They've basically like a brainstem. And of course, they don't have, you would say, like every full functioning property of human consciousness there. But I think you can see videos of these human beings. They are human beings. They're alive. They have some experience. They don't have the full breadth of human experience. They can't speak. And I don't think they generally live very long. But I think it would be very hard to look at those videos or photos and say those people don't have experience. And they have barely the roots of a brain, like barely just a brain stem. I think the brain scans are quite bizarre because it's literally just empty there and you can just see the stem. So even that, there are case studies that even challenge those basic assumptions of.
Yeah, well, right. So in other words, the brain is not necessary, but it is sufficient for consciousness, for human consciousness. Even that, you see, yeah. The Lorber case, by the way, that I mentioned is a classic case there, but he was fully functional. He's just this maths student. He has a slightly larger head than normal, but otherwise fully functional, but he had no brain. But he had neurons, yeah. Yeah, Lorber case, 70s case, it's a really interesting case. But yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, so we can't even say that. And also, maybe the brain is not sufficient. Maybe you need the whole nervous system, because the brain is an abstraction. Really, it's connected to the nervous system going through, and the nervous system is connected to the whole body, right? And then the body's connected to your environment, and then you get into these 4 cognition theories that you need the external environment in order to have consciousness as well. And then if you go all the way, you become pantheist.
Honestly, I'm totally on board. I've absolutely no logical arguments to push back on that, and it's completely correct. I think it's so interesting, so interesting. That's why I'd like to see more work being done. It is kind of hard to know what, like, if you were the panpsychist, emperor of the world, you've just been given 100 billion. Like what does research really look like here? Do you think we need to develop new technology? Is it completely new experimental paradigms? Like, how do we make progress here to
Mm.
prove that an electron has experience?
Well, I mean, there's a number of small steps one can take. I mean, when you look at plant, the latest kind of science coming out of plant biology is really fascinating. You know, that plants can perceive in many different ways and react accordingly. Like a leaf is basically like an eye, you know, in many cases, and they have memory. There's a lot of interesting stuff about plant memory. So, as that progresses, we see that, you know, plants become more and more animal-like, you know, and with animals, people are much more you know, happy to attribute consciousness to them, right? So that's one way in which I think science can approach this question, just looking at, you know, just exploring more of the activity of plants, you know, without just assuming that they are passive beings. Another way that we kind of touched on before was why not look at full body scans when you're looking at consciousness, you know?
Yes, I like
Maybe
this. Yeah.
these things will be found there. I mean, we know about the gut-brain axis already. There was a paper that came out a few months ago about how oral hygienes are linked to depression,
Yes,
right?
cognition. I've been seeing stuff about that as well. Yeah. It is a holistic process. We draw these, again, arbitrary lines, but like even brain and body, I don't even like that distinction anymore because, you know, like it is just a holistic system constantly talking to itself. It's very not obvious where you draw the boundaries and it still maintains the, you know, the function of that system. Like a brain without the body, you're right. I don't think is a brain, or not in the way we classically think of a brain.
Right. Yeah. And then, of course, technology, you know, fMRI and EEG is kind of very limited, as you will know better than I do. And hopefully with technological improvements, we'll be able to, like maybe someone in a hospital bed, you know, you scan their brain, maybe the activity will be very different when they're outside in nature running about or something like that, right? If you can scan that and compare those differences, that would say a lot as well. And then, you know, consider what the essential correlates of consciousness are in terms of behavior. Not that behavior is identical to consciousness, but, you know, then will be able to apply it to plants as well. And of course, you know, another interesting factor we haven't even mentioned yet is AI, the possibility of machine consciousness, right?
Yeah.
If you believe in that, then you're not a neuroessentialist. You don't think the brain's necessarily sufficient for consciousness. But then how do we determine it? You know, what are the, let's say it is integrated to information even, right? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for consciousness if we go beyond the brain? When we get the essence of that, if we had the answer to that, it'd be like a scanner. You could scan a plant and say, yeah, that's like conscious, and computer, that's conscious. But how do you determine this? You can come up with a theory like IIT about, you know, like determining the extent of consciousness, but how do you prove it, right? How can you test it? And we get back to the same stumbling block, which is privacy. So I think a lot of more work needs to be done on what we mean by privacy. I mean, there is a lot of literature on it already, but, you know, like taking privacy, if you really seriously, let's say if neuroscientists, for example, or cognitive scientists took privacy a bit more seriously and thought about what it means in relation to evidence, and what it means therefore in relation to prior, you know, like axiomatic beliefs, metaphysical beliefs, that I think would change people, you know. Also, another important thing is to sort of take all this away from connotations of religion or religious belief or spiritual belief, right?
Right.
It's got nothing. I mean, not nothing to do with that. It's related, but it's not really. It's just like let's just take it theoretically, logically. I think you'd just be able to persuade a lot more people then, just open up their minds a bit more.
Yes.
Because
I agree with that.
why is it related to religion? Here's another interesting question. Like, why do we think, in my experience, and it's purely anecdotal, but, you know, I meet a lot of people and they think, well, either you're a physicalist or you're a dualist, and that's it. And dualism, of course, is always tied to the church. So they think that if, you know, basically, if you're denying materialism, you're going into the, you know, religious territory, and then a lot of people in Europe at least want to avoid that. But that's not the case. You know, there are many other options than dualism, physicalism, as I mentioned, you know, like monism, idealism, transcendentalism, etc.
Yes.
Just present people the options and say, and actually, what got me out of physicalism is when I looked at all the different types of physicalism, and I saw like, okay, these are the problems with this type, these are the problems with this type, you know, and you think, okay, so which type am I? And then you think, why am I any of them? They're all problematic, right? And then it sort of opens up your horizons further.
Yes. I love all this. I think this conversation has been.
I just want to, one more caveat to all this is like,
Please.
that's not just neuroscience is not essential to understanding consciousness. It is absolutely, but like neuroscience, science, but it's not metaphysics, right? Science is empirical observation and so on. It doesn't have to take a physicalist metaphysic under it. It has done for political historical reasons, but it needn't.
Yeah.
Aristotle tried to base science on monism in the last century and failed, but he tried. Ernst Haeckel, who was the famous promoter of Darwin in Germany and coined the word ecology and was a great artist, But we're basically, science is operating on Cartesian ground at the moment still. Fundamentally dualist, but they don't realize it.
Peter, this has been such a fun conversation. I've learned so much. You're an amazing communicator, and I love the historical context, which I don't usually get on these podcasts. So I've really appreciated that. I've learned a lot. Is there anything that you're super excited about in any of the things that we've discussed today, in fast forwarding into the future, 10, 20 years down the line? Like, what's the thing in science that makes you excited, that gives you goosebumps? Anything related to psychedelics, consciousness, anything in between, a merger of the two? Like, what's a really cool thing that you think we're going to see?
I think that the 20th century has been very reductive in terms of consciousness, and my hope and actually expectation is that we are going to open up to many more metaphysical possibilities in the next few decades. I think psychedelics will be a catalyst for that, not the only reason, but it will be helpful because in trying to understand psychedelic experiences, it's useful to look at metaphysics of mind. So this is what I see, and what I really hope, therefore, is that science, which has been restricted really to, in the English-speaking world, to physics, chemistry, and biology, will just expand to more the German sense of Wissenschaft, like wisdom craft, a methodological study of the mind, which will then integrate logic, philosophy of mind, metaphysics into its essence, and thus that will lead to new hypotheses, new experiments, which hopefully will give us, greater answers, or at least get us a bit closer to some kind of understanding. This happened with epigenetics. I mentioned it, when Charles Waddington changed his hypotheses following this sort of metaphysics of Alfred North Whitehead. He devised new experiments, and this led to epigenetics, which before then was scientific heresy, right?
Yeah.
But now it's established science in university departments and with conferences and literature about it. I think this is just indicative of what's going to happen. And I do think that, with Descartes and the Reformation Descartes, we had this real reduction of the soul to the human, right? And then over time, it's kind of expanded a bit. Okay, we'll give it to dolphins and dogs and stuff, but I think there's more and more. I mean, the British law changed to make it legal to kill octopuses and lobsters directly in boiling water because there's a kind of,
I think that horror that ever existed. Yeah.
Yeah. It's strange that people thought lobsters and octopuses weren't conscious before that, right? Legally, at least.
Yeah, it's mental.
But it's representative of a general idea that, consciousness is a very small part of the universe and is restricted to brains. I think this is expanding. AI is probably going to change things as well, the way of thinking about it.
Yes.
Plant, like I say, the theoretical stuff I was talking about in philosophy, panpsychism stuff, all of that's going to push our understanding. And I believe we'll return more to the ancient Greek understanding of the universe as an organism as opposed to a machine. I think this is the future.
Super interesting. We'll revert back to our roots and go back. That's so interesting, Peter. This has been immensely fun. Thank you so much for your time. I'm already excited for round 2. You are such an interesting man, and I think this has been so much fun. I learned so much. I hope the listeners were able to keep along, and there wasn't too many isms, because I think that can be difficult sometimes. But yeah, it's been an immense pleasure. It's been a great conversation. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Evan. It's been a pleasure on my side as well. Thank you.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free